up the live stream. There we go. Okay. Hello, everyone. Bonjour à tous. Welcome to Concordia University's fourth space. Thank you for joining us for today's event, Unlocking the Potential of Climate Finance. Libérer le potentiel de la finance climatique. This event is organized by LEADS, which is the Leadership in Environmental and Digital Innovation for Sustainability. And to help situate you, we are streaming to YouTube live from fourth space, and we are located on unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. Here at Fourth Space, we work with our university community to help mobilize knowledge by co-creating daily activities that examine research questions in development across the university. We're running today's event as a live stream meeting, so we welcome comments or questions from Zoom in the chat, and we'll get those to our panelists. For those of you in the space, during the Q&A, if you have any questions, let us know by raising your hand, and we'll get a microphone to you. And with that, it is very much my pleasure to hand it over to Professor in the Department of Geography, Planning and Environment, but also the Program Director of LEADS, Damon Matthews. Damon.
Thank you, Doug. And thank you, everyone, for being here today. This event is part of our monthly or so speaker workshop series as part of the LEADS program. I'll also be happy to welcome those of you who are joining us from FinML, which is another CREATE program. And yeah, so we're very happy to have you all here. So the theme of today's panel is climate finance. So trying to join the finance theme of FinML with the sustainability theme of the LEADS program. I think it's also one of the big sustainability challenges is how to mobilize the potential of the world of finance towards meeting climate objectives. I mean, there's certainly many gaps in the climate mitigation space, and the finance gap is one of the really important ones. So we may touch on some of these questions today. So we have four lovely panelists with us today. I'll quickly introduce them. Each is going to speak for about 5 minutes or so by way of introduction. We'll have a bit of a discussion, questions from the audience, and then there should be time at the end to speak with anyone you didn't get a chance to, or ask follow-up questions more informally. There's some coffee and snacks at the back of the room. So I think we'll get started. I'll introduce the speakers as they appear. We'll start across the table. This is Jennifer Garard. She is the Deputy Director of Sustainability in the Digital Age and Future Earth Canada office. She's also affiliate assistant professor in the Department of Geography, Planning and Environment at Concordia. And she's going to speak in general terms about framing the finance challenge with respect to climate mitigation. So over to you, and you have the little. Sorry, give me 1 second, and I will load up your slides here.
Thank you so much, Damon. Thank you, everybody, for joining us here today. So as Damon mentioned, I am with Sustainability in the Digital Age and Future Earth Canada. Maybe while we're pulling up the slides, I'll just really briefly give a quick overview. So Future Earth, our office here in Montreal in Canada is one of 9 global hubs that form together an international platform for accelerating transformations to sustainability through partnerships, innovation, collaboration. And Sustainability in the Digital Age, SDA, as we call it, is a think tank based here at Concordia University and now the host of the Future Earth Canada Hub. So thrilled to be here today and happy to be here with my fellow panelists. Oh, maybe. Okay.
That might have been me, but if it doesn't advance, let me know. I'll do it for you.
Okay. Thank you, Damon. So I would say that, for me, financing climate action has really taken center stage over the last 5-10 years. In a report that came out just last year by Rockefeller Foundation and Boston Consulting Group, it was noted that $3.8 trillion annually are going to be needed to reach net zero biodiversity goals, but only 16% of that is currently available. And I've seen other reports that actually have cited even higher amounts. So, this is hugely concerning in terms of that gap in what's needed and what's been made available. Many discussions now are really focusing on the need to fill this finance gap through mechanisms that actually bridge between mitigation, adaptation, and biodiversity action or nature conservation. So, there's been a lot of discussions at the Climate and Biodiversity Conference of the Parties, the COP meetings, at the World Economic Forum. And it's also been a bit of a hot topic, I would say, in a lot of scientific and policy publications. For example, reports by the International Monetary Fund and the OECD. Just about a month ago or so, the mayor of Montreal, Valérie Plante, actually spoke in the context of New York Climate Week in front of NASDAQ, talking about a lot of the sustainability finance innovations taking place right here in Montreal. So I would say that recognizing the need for more holistic approaches that start to bridge between mitigation, adaptation, biodiversity is definitely a start. But moving forward, I think putting that recognition of the need into action will actually require rethinking the framework in which climate finance takes place. Yeah, I don't think this is, sorry. Thank you, David. So here I wanted to share some of the findings from a project that we did that we published about a year ago in partnership with the ClimateWorks Foundation on reimagining climate governance in the digital age. And so this figure that we have on the slide here comes out of an engagement process we had with over 100 people around the world back in 2021. And a central message that really emerged regarding how we need to actually rethink this framework is around the need to collaborate across different funding communities to unlock the potential of innovative, digitally enabled climate strategies. So really starting to align between private sector, public sector, philanthropy, and other groups. And a major finding here was really the need to change the reporting culture to foster what we kind of started to call failing forward. So learning from the past and integrating that into strategic decision-making much more seamlessly to enable much more agile, visionary, forward-looking planning. Let's go to the next slide. Thank you. So starting off, I just wanted to run through this figure really quickly, and then I'll hand off to my wonderful colleagues here. So looking at co-learning and trust, so we found it was really important to foster safe, inclusive, and open exchanges between actors that are currently very disconnected at this interface of digitally enabled strategies, finance, and climate governance. We also found that creating pre-competitive spaces to openly explore new ideas can be really helpful in terms of surfacing new forms of partnership, new funding arrangements that might not have emerged in more competitive market-ready spaces. And thirdly, here, I wanted to just mention that really sort of supporting, but also openly experimenting with and sharing experiences with pilot projects, so very early stage developments, is really a critical component of failing forward. So to be able to really learn from what's happening in those early stages. Moving on to look a little bit at testing and co-development. So first of all, we wanted to think here about testing different funding mechanisms, and in particular, thinking about blended finance, where, for example, philanthropy might be able to invest early on to really de-risk some very innovative, very new and high-risk opportunities, taking on some of those early costs and losses as a philanthropic donation, but then paving the way and planning to pave the way for other forms of finance to come in later down the line. On evaluating impact, we really found that there was a need to shift towards more inclusive and ethical evaluation criteria when we're looking at different types of climate finance programs. So a few examples of some of the criteria that came up through our different consultations. So there was a lot of folks who were really concerned about third-party validation to start mitigating bias. There was a lot of focus on prioritizing initiatives that had the potential to scale or replicate in other contexts and could demonstrate that early on. a need to include local actors actually in the evaluation process itself and even in developing the criteria for evaluation. And lastly, to really also evaluate data ownership models. So not just taking for granted that the data would be gathered, but also thinking about who owned that in the earliest stages. And lastly, I just wanted to mention here that we need to reassess a little bit how we conceptualize value. So not only thinking about the produced capital, but also looking beyond towards natural, social, and human capital in valuation metrics. And last time, thank you, David. So finally, this will be my last few points. So I wanted to talk about integration and scale. So we found that it was really important for initiatives to plan at the very beginning for longer term financial sustainability. So a lot of time what we see in climate action are projects that depend on, short term, either research funding or philanthropic funding that has an endpoint. And, the question remains, what happens to the project after that funding ends? And so, this will require actually changing a little bit the way that these climate projects are conceptualized at the outset, thinking about business models and new forms of theory of change. The second point here is the need to actually decomplexify the way that we communicate, especially very complicated digitally enabled solutions tend to be communicated in language that essentially excludes a lot of people from being able to engage in those projects. And so thinking about those communications is really critical. And thirdly, it's also always important to think about context in relation to sharing the lessons learned. So thinking about which of the factors that are associated with the success or failure of a project are directly tied to context and which can be generalized to really be able to learn lessons for projects more broadly. So with that, I will sign off. Thank you so much. Looking forward to the Q&A, and I'll pass over to Karine after, I think, a short introduction, Damon.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Jen. So yeah, next is Karine Royer. Karine va parler en français aujourd'hui. Je pense dans la Q&A, si tu veux demander des questions, tu peux les poser en français ou en anglais également, mais pour le moment, on va switcher la langue. Karine vient du Beneva, du côté de Beneva. Elle est le Senior Risk Management Consultant at Beneva, specializing in climate risk. Elle a plus de 15 ans d'expérience dans différents rôles de surveillance des risques auprès des institutions financières. Elle a un baccalauréat de l'Université Laval depuis 2004 et elle est également titulaire d'une fellowship de l'Institut canadien des actuaires, de la Société des actuaries. Puis en 2022, elle a réussi la certification Sustainability and Climate Risk au part du Global Association of Risk Professionals. So, merci beaucoup d'être là et c'est à vous.
Bien, merci beaucoup. Ça me fait plaisir d'être parmi vous aujourd'hui. Donc, oui, en fait, de mon côté, j'ai un bagage professionnel davantage au niveau des institutions financières, donc en surveillance. Avant d'être chez Beneva dans l'équipe de gestion des risques, Beneva est une mutuelle d'assurance partout au Canada. J'ai aussi travaillé à l'Autorité des marchés financiers du côté de la surveillance des assureurs. Donc, ça m'a permis d'avoir une bonne connaissance de la réglementation qui s'applique pour les assureurs au Canada. Donc, avant de vous parler davantage là, de l'impact du risque climatique sur les assureurs, j'aurais peut-être pris les quelques minutes qui me sont allouées pour vous donner un petit peu plus de contexte, là, une meilleure vue sur ce que fait une équipe de gestion de risque au niveau d'un assureur, parce que je pense que c'est encore un domaine qui peut être parfois méconnu, puis notamment pour les acteurs, c'est encore un domaine de profession qui est non traditionnel. Donc, contrairement à ce qu'on pense, la gestion des risques, on a le mot gestion dans notre nom de fonction, mais on ne gère pas les risques, on les surveille et puis ça permet que les preneurs de risques sont vraiment... Je crois que le micro... Ah, parfait, désolée. Donc, nos secteurs d'affaires sont nos premières lignes et ce sont eux qui prennent les risques. Donc, l'affaire ici, on entend ceux qui ont vraiment l'assurance. Je crois que mon micro, il y a... Désolée. Plus proche, hein? Parfait. Donc, les secteurs d'affaires, donc ceux qui sont vraiment dans les opérations, qui vont soit effectuer les placements avec les primes qu'on collecte ou qui vont vendre ou tarifer, offrir nos produits d'assurance, soit en auto-habitation ou en assurance de personnes. Donc, nous, on est en surveillance des risques que ces secteurs d'affaires-là prennent pour s'assurer que ce sont les risques que les instances comme le conseil d'administration qui sont pris selon ce sont le type et le niveau de risque que les instances souhaitent prendre pour réaliser la stratégie de l'assureur. Donc, ça nous permet de ne pas être juge et partie. Donc, c'est pour ça qu'on ne gère pas les risques, mais bien qu'on les surveille. Une autre notion importante au niveau d'une équipe de gestion de risque, c'est qu'on a une vue transversale des activités chez un assureur. Donc, chaque secteur a sa vue de ce qu'il fait dans son secteur. Nous, ça nous permet de tout mettre ça ensemble et de s'assurer que la prise de risque, elle est au niveau souhaité au global pour l'institution. Et finalement, un autre rôle important qu'on a, c'est évidemment de rapporter sur cette prise de risque-là au conseil d'administration périodiquement. Donc, on est un peu leurs yeux et leurs oreilles au niveau de l'opérationnalisation. Donc, c'est un autre rôle important qu'on a à jouer comme équipe de gestion de risque. Donc, assurément que le risque climatique nous occupe de plus en plus, je dirais, au niveau des assureurs. Donc, ça va me faire plaisir de vous en parler davantage tout à l'heure. Merci.
Okay, merci Karine. On te revient à bientôt. Donc, next up is Dr. Manuel Morales, who is the director of the FinML Create Network. He comes to us from the University of Montreal, where he works in the field of applied artificial intelligence in banking and investment. And, you know, I think a lot of the theme of Manuel's research is to help train the next generation of AI-enabled finance and banking professionals while building bridges between the industry sector and the research community in the province of Quebec. He's currently working on the impact of AI in measuring and reporting ESG footprints, environmental, social, and governance footprints in the context of sustainable finance. And lastly, he's an active member of the FinTech community in Montreal, where he plays different roles as advisor and founder. So again, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Half a second to load your presentation.
We'll Thanks for the opportunity. I'm happy to be here. I'm happy that we finally managed to do one event together, the two create programs that we have in Montreal. So maybe what I thought about sharing today is my experience with the sustainable finance space, which is very recent activity that I have in this space. Maybe there are two places where I've been working on this lately. One would be using NLP, natural language processing, in assessing the footprint of companies through their reports, their ESG reports, sustainability reports, and others. So that's a project that we have with a postdoc and a team of researchers and students at the University of Montreal. That's one. The other one, which is one that I shared the slides for, that you are seeing now, it's another one that it's more on the entrepreneurial side. So I'm also involved with the Montreal innovation ecosystem. For a few years now, I think this is my third startup, always with students. So and all of them are alive. So that's a good sign. So this is the third one. And it's about, maybe I will share a little bit about my experience with this, and maybe that will feed a little bit the discussion today. So in 5 minutes quickly. So this one is about voluntary carbon market. So with a friend of mine and an ex-student, we look at this market, and we saw that in principle, and again, this is a very recent experience that we have, seems to be like an interesting mechanism to fund or finance projects that are actually either avoiding, reducing, or removing emissions from the atmosphere, right? So it's a over-the-counter market where companies can buy these offsets, and the money that goes to this would eventually reach the actual projects that are doing one of these three things. So it seems to be an interesting mechanism from the financial perspective. But then we are noticing three challenges, and these three challenges motivated the actual innovation that we're trying to pursue here. So one of them is transparency, right? So everybody has heard about these scandals where there are these certifiers that it turns out that maybe 90% of the carbon offsets that they sell, 90% of them are phantom. So either they sell the little tree twice, or there's no an actual project behind that we can actually measure the capture or reduction that they are bringing. So transparency, liquidity as well. So there are many types of offsets that you can find in these over-the-counter markets, right? So it can be nature-based, so offsets that are financing projects that are preserve nature, that it's at risk. Agricultural-based, to mention a few. So agricultural practices that are by their nature capturing more carbon than naturally would occur. Or technology-based, so technology projects that are capturing physically a mechanism that captures carbon. So either one of these, there's a process that goes from project to an actual viable carbon offset that a company can buy, and the liquidity is scarce, and the quality of this liquidity is also needs to be addressed. So that's another issue. And then there's the efficiency one, right? Because when we're looking at agricultural-based offsets, for instance, it turns out that maybe for every dollar that the company pays for this offset, actually maybe half of it just disappears in the way. So the project only gets half of it. So there's an efficiency from the market perspective in terms of how the money actually, the mechanism that funds this project works. So we are addressing that from this platform, Pitaya Finance. That's the name of the startup. Pitaya, for those of you who know what that is, it's a fruit that it's local from Mexico and actually Latin America. So it's a fruit that grows on a cactus. So that just reflects the local dimension of this effort. So the effort is global, right? But it's very local. So it depends on the people around the projects and the land. So that's what this represents. So basically, it's a marketplace. So this voluntary carbon markets, it's an over-the-counter. So there's no actual marketplace where you can find liquidity. Sorry. And this just illustrates the back end. So we're currently in the validation process. We are part of the CDL, so Constructive Destruction Lab here in Montreal. And this just illustrates one potential flow, and I will just stop there. So like I said, it could be energy-based, technology-based, nature-based, agricultural-based. So this illustrates an agricultural-based offset, but more or less the steps would be the same. So there's some onboarding, right? So either it's land or projects, there's some data collection that needs to take place. So in this case, it would be satellite imaging. There's computation as well. So we need to compute. So there's a mapping between the data points that we get, either satellite imaging on the ground, sensors, drones, you name it. A computation that needs to be done, and that has to be done also in a transparent way. So that's where we are bringing the blockchain technology to validate the data points, but also the computation, so that both can be validated that they have been carried out in an open way. So open standards, open data concept. Then having that on chain so that can be validated without being technical. So there will be a unique representation of each of those projects so that the transparency comes in. And then there will be a private section of the marketplace where you can bring some value to the corporation that is buying these offsets, right? Because another pain point that they flag is that since it's an over-the-counter market, you have lots of different types of data aggregated maybe on a drive or an Excel sheet. So when you want to do some analytics or understanding what your position is with respect to your target, so they are having some pain points there. So the platform addresses those issues. So there's AI, there's data, there's machine learning inside, there's blockchain. So that's the idea, and I'm going to stop there.
Hey, screen manager here. Thank you, and And we will come back to you in the question period. So last up is Jennifer McDonald, who is newly the Senior Vice President of Investments at a climate tech accelerator called Cycle Momentum. And she's leading an investment matching program for climate startups in Quebec. And Jen, in addition to being a neighbor and good friend of mine, is also an active angel investor and advisor in climate technology, has a couple of decades of experience looking at how to scale businesses for impact. Prior to being at Cycle Momentum, she led strategy, product, and operations as the chief operating officer at the startup Mocha Financial Technologies. And previous to that, spent a lot of time traveling around the world looking at financing in emerging markets with experience in Africa, Latin America, and South Asia. So thank you again for being with us, Jen. And let me switch to your presentation.
Great, thanks. Hello, good. Thanks very much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here and be part of this panel. I've been looking forward to this. So I'll start by saying that I'm a huge believer in the idea that finance can be a catalyst for change. It's something that I've been working on my whole life. You heard a lot of different roles that I've played in my life there from Damon. I studied economics. I went overseas and worked on deploying commercial microfinance banks for a while. I led a product team that was working with banks and mobile phone companies to figure out how to get access to bank accounts for lower income people using digital technologies like mobile banking. I spent a lot of time on airplanes, so my carbon footprint is off the charts. And then about 5 years ago, I decided that startups had this huge potential to really innovate and bring change in ways that it was hard for corporates to do. So my midlife crisis, I went off and joined a startup and was part of a fintech company that was successful and sold. And then I stepped back and said, now what do I do? And Damon was one of the first people that I spoke to about curiosity around climate. And he recommended a book to me. This is not working.
Test.
So Damon recommended a book that gave me the confidence to move into the climate space. Up until that point, I thought that other people with better expertise than me were going to fix this. And then I suddenly realized, okay, it's not them fixing it, it's all of us fixing it. So we should all try to do what we can to make a difference. So I looked around and I said, okay, there are a lot of startups that are building things to try to bring solutions and do things differently. And I realized that what we have to do here is reinvent everything. We need to drive this energy transition. We need to bring so many different types of products to replace the things that are already working. And I realized that there were a lot of people who are working on building these things. So the amount of money that needs to flow into this transition is enormous. I think Jennifer mentioned it. It's $4 trillion a year. So what I'm going to talk about a little bit is why we're excited about the potential for venture capital to help to speed that. And it's mainly around this idea that startups can move fast. They can move a lot faster than corporates, and they can help corporates to see new ways of doing business in a way that's really transformational. So that's why I'm excited about my new job. So I've got some slides to introduce to you the program that I'm going to be working on. So Cycle Momentum is a climate tech accelerator. It's been around since 2015. It's part of a venture capital group called Cycle Capital, which is the largest climate tech VC fund in Canada, based here in Montreal. Since 2015, the Cycle Momentum core climate acceleration activities have had about 117 startups go through, with a 90% survival rate. And those companies have gone on to raise $320 million. And to date, we estimate that it's about 13,600 tons of GHG emissions that have been avoided. So these companies are small and they're going to scale. And as they grow, they're going to do more and more benefits for the economy and for the climate. We work across all different sectors, so I can pull out all kinds of different examples of great startups that are working on those kind of solutions. But basically, I'm motivated every day by looking at the people who are building things to reinvent the economy in a way that's more sustainable and seeing how we can put finance to work to help them to do that. So recently, we announced a new program, which I joined Cycle Momentum to lead, which is called Origo. It's a pre-seed and seed stage investment matching program for climate technology companies in Quebec. We'll be doing 10 investments a year. These are small checks, $150,000 per startup, but with the idea of being able to leverage that by bringing other investors to join. So this is fun. These are funds that have come from the Ministry of the Environment of Quebec. It's with the goal of setting up a program that will be evergreen, meaning that as we make returns from those funds, they'll be plowed back into new companies as they come up. So we're not looking to gain a return in order to give the money back to the owners of the capital, but to continue to maintain it indefinitely. And we're seeking commercial returns in order to be able to do that. So this is an example of catalytic capital, so funds coming from the government being used to leverage private investment into the companies that can become the new generation of climate champions in Quebec. And just to give you an example of some of the types of actors that are going to be part of this, over the last couple of years, Cycle Momentum has put together a kind of an investment club of close to over 40 different venture capital funds, institutional investors, corporate venture capital funds, and family offices. So these are all investors that are investing in climate solutions, and they've all said, we're interested in seeing the deal flow that's coming from Quebec, new companies that are coming up and that are building these climate solutions. And these are all companies that have said that they want to meet those companies that are coming through. So these are our co-investors that we'll be working with to be able to make those investments. I'll say that when I think about the role of venture capital, what I think of is how startups are able to move fast. And I think everyone's aware that the climate situation requires really urgent action. We need to be able to move fast and deploy quickly. The kinds of startups that we're talking about are ones where the technology is no longer a risk. It's really about deploying it as quickly as possible. And in a lot of cases, that involves, new business models. And it's hard for large companies to do that kind of innovation because it requires testing and finding out what works. And you have to iterate on it to get to that point. So startups are in a really great position to do that. And with the right support and access to markets and the right capital to let them scale to the point where they can be attractive businesses that can then work in partnership with corporates or be acquired by them, then that's a great way to really begin to scale those climate solutions in a way that's meaningful. So I'll stop there because I know we're going to get more into discussion, but thank you for letting me be here.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone for your opening thoughts. So yeah, I mean, peut-être tu veux commencer avec Karine. Je veux vraiment savoir un peu plus à propos de quels sont les impacts du risque climatique pour les assureurs et puis aussi que peuvent faire les assureurs pour limiter les risques climatiques, non juste pour les assureurs eux-mêmes, mais plus généralement en société.
Oui, bien, en fait, pour les assureurs, le risque climatique, c'est sûr que il y a quand même plusieurs impacts. Je débuterai par peut-être juste parler des deux volets du risque climatique là, pour être sûr qu'on a tous la même terminologie, la même compréhension. Il y a le risque physique, donc les manifestations climatiques, celles dont on a beaucoup parlé, notamment en 2023, comme les feux de forêt, les précipitations extrêmes, comme les pluies très intenses de l'été, les vagues de chaleur extrêmes qu'on voit un peu partout sur la planète. Donc, tout ça, c'est des manifestations climatiques qu'on qualifie de risques physiques. Donc, c'est sûr que ce volet-là impacte les assureurs au niveau de leur core business, que je dirais, leur risque d'assurance. Donc, en générant notamment des réclamations en plus grande quantité et aussi même au niveau de la sévérité, ça peut être des réclamations plus coûteuses. Il y a aussi le volet du risque de transition, qui est l'autre volet du risque climatique. Donc, ce volet-là, c'est le risque qu'on transitionne vers une économie faible en carbone, mais de façon abrupte et désordonnée. Donc, que ça ait beaucoup d'impact, notamment au niveau des marchés, que ça crée de la volatilité sur les marchés. Donc, ça, c'est un autre risque pour les assureurs, étant donné qu'on est quand même des grands investisseurs. Au-delà de ça, le risque climatique amène aussi des impacts donc, sur tous les risques usuels qu'un assureur est habitué de gérer. Donc, ça peut être aussi sur le risque de crédit, donc au niveau des emprunteurs, des émetteurs dans qui on fait des placements. Ça peut être aussi, advenant des manifestations climatiques, on peut faire face à un risque de liquidité supplémentaire. Et il y a aussi tout le volet risque opérationnel, donc des événements climatiques importants pourraient mettre un risque au niveau de nos processus, de notre fonctionnement. Donc, il faut s'assurer d'être résilient, donc essayer le moins possible que nos assurés aient de bris dans leur parcours. Donc, c'est-à-dire que quand ils s'attendent d'avoir un service de la part d'un assureur, ils espèrent l'avoir, notamment quand il y a des événements climatiques qui peuvent survenir. Donc, ça nous amène à réfléchir au niveau opérationnel. Le risque climatique aussi, une autre façon qui impacte les assureurs, c'est qu'il impacte tous nos risques habituels, mais également l'ensemble des secteurs d'affaires dans lesquels les assureurs opèrent. C'est-à-dire que le risque physique, notamment par les vagues de chaleur, par même les feux de forêt, ça peut impacter les activités au niveau de l'assurance de personnes. Donc, quand on fait de l'assurance vie, quand on assure des vies ou même la santé de travailleurs au niveau de l'assurance de groupe. Mais ça affecte aussi, évidemment, l'assurance auto-habitation. Donc, ça peut venir un peu rendre incertain la diversification qu'on était habitué d'avoir au niveau de nos différents offres de produits et lignes d'affaires. Puis, le risque climatique, en plus, au niveau de la diversification, comme on le retrouve sur toute la planète, c'est un autre niveau où la diversification qu'on pouvait peut-être espérer avoir entre nos différentes lignes d'affaires dans notre portefeuille de placement, là, on se retrouve un petit peu à moins le voir, étant donné qu'on le retrouve partout. Donc, ça, c'est les grands impacts, je dirais, pour les assureurs du risque climatique. Donc, c'est vraiment un risque qu'on retrouve qui est de nature transversale, je dirais. L'autre volet de la question, c'était qu'est-ce que les assureurs peuvent faire. Donc, les assureurs, évidemment, comme le gouvernement canadien, beaucoup d'assureurs se sont engagés publiquement à devenir net zéro dès 2050. Donc, de réduire totalement leur émission de carbone. Donc, pour pouvoir établir leur plan de transition, la première étape, je dirais que c'est d'être capable de mesurer les émissions de carbone actuelles qu'ils génèrent. Donc, pour ça, là, au niveau international, il y a une méthodologie là, qui est établie. Donc, on parle des émissions de portée 1, 2, 3. Pour les assureurs, donc les portées 1, le scope, je peux peut-être le dire en anglais pour le bénéfice de l'auditoire. Donc, je ne sais pas, on entend souvent les émissions de scope 1, 2, 3. Donc, les émissions de scope 1, c'est celles qui sont générées directement par l'entreprise. Donc, de nos bâtisses, si on a on offre des véhicules de fonction, des trucs comme ça. Donc, pour les assureurs, ce n'est pas nécessairement là où on émet le plus de GES. Les émissions de Scope 2, c'est celles qui proviennent de l'énergie qu'on consomme pour offrir nos produits. Donc, là, ici au Québec, on est quand même choyé étant donné qu'on a l'électricité. Donc, là aussi, c'est plutôt marginal. Au niveau du scope 3, c'est là où on retrouve le plus grand de nos émissions au niveau d'un assureur. Donc, on a 2 volets dans le scope 3. On a le volet émissions financées qu'on appelle, donc celles qui viennent de tout notre portefeuille de placement, étant donné qu'on est un grand investisseur, étant donné toutes les primes que l'on collecte sur une base récurrente. Puis, on a l'autre volet du scope 3 qui est les émissions assurées, donc celles qui proviennent de notre offre de produits par exemple, les voitures à essence qu'on assure. Donc, les assureurs, ben pour l'instant, il y a 5 ans, on ne pensait pas être obligé de calculer toutes nos émissions de carbone. Ça évolue très vite, donc on suit la méthodologie, mais c'est un premier pas, c'est de s'être engagé net zéro 2050 et pour établir notre plan de transition, ben, c'est de bien calculer nos émissions. Puis voilà. Merci.
Yeah, so I mean, picking up on this idea of net zero emissions, maybe a good segue to carbon credits and carbon offsets. I mean, net zero implies that either you get to 0 or you have to think about how you're going to treat the emissions that you can't eliminate. And so I'm wondering about your thoughts on the general state of affairs of carbon credits and carbon offsets and how they should be used and maybe how they shouldn't be used in terms of thinking about corporate net zero goals.
Yeah, well, and that may be a short answer. So the experience that I'm sharing here today is from our standpoint of validation phase. We're just beginning to understand ourselves, this market. We're focusing more on the technology side of how we use technology to bring liquidity and address those 3 points that I said: efficiency, liquidity, and transparency. And through this validation process, we are seeing a few things that answer that question. So one would be, and then again, that's from our perspective, seems to be an interesting mechanism that it's already there. Like how companies that have pledged to being net zero into 2050, but have to abate their emissions. It's expensive to do that. So the carbon credit, the carbon offset voluntary market gives a way for companies to have a transition that makes sense, that can be reached economically, but then that by doing that can also fund directly projects that do more in that direction, right? So the mechanism seems to make sense, at least from the finance standpoint and from the technology point of view. But then there's how it actually, the state of affairs right now. So I think it was early this year, like this big scandal where there's this certifier, Vera, which is like one of the largest, if not the largest, where I mentioned that earlier, like it turned out that 90% or something crazy like that of their offsets were not real offsets. So that underscores a very important problem that they face, right? So I think there's a general sense of or lack of trust in this space. So corporations that are trying to use this mechanism to get to these net zero strategies or target, so they are seeing this with some suspicion, right? So what's a carbon credit that it's valid? How do I validate that the data behind it and that the computation, how do they estimate the actual number of metric tons that get sequestered or reduced or avoided? How do they compute that? So those are pain points. And then again, the liquidity, that the efficiency that I mentioned earlier. So I think, and maybe the others could elaborate more on that, I think the mechanism, it's there for a reason. It's a proven mechanism even before climate crisis, right? It's how do we make that the flow capital goes to the place we want it to go? So marketplaces have always been there to do that in a more or less efficient way. So we're using that now for this specific target. So it is there. We just need to find ways to make it work the way it's supposed to work, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that so in part of my academic life, I think about the particularly related to nature-based carbon removal or carbon offset mechanisms, how much carbon is actually sequestered and how long it stays there, because there's little value in offsetting carbon that just gets lost if the next wildfire comes through. And so, from a scientific perspective, it often seems to be the case that the the presence of offsets, if they're not real offsets, actually make the problem worse, not better, because you end up having more emissions over time than you otherwise would. On the other hand, there's a lot of financial flows associated with carbon offsets that some of which, even if the carbon isn't successful, there are other co-benefits of that finance flow for conservation or for biodiversity or for livelihoods in the global south. And so, yeah, I'm wondering what your thoughts are, if anyone else on the panel has thoughts about how to reconcile those things, and how to make the system work in a way that
that's
actually contributes to climate change in a real way, but also doesn't stifle the other benefits of that finance.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's something that we saw. So there's the concept of additionality. So actually, you need the projects that you want to validate and onboard on the market. It might be a good idea, but you need to also evaluate not only the carbon that they are trying to avoid, reduce, or remove, but also how much they emit themselves by doing that. So there's a complicated computation that needs to be carried out, and sometimes, especially in the early forestry preservation offsets, it's just a tree and the tree's there, but there's not actual additionality to the process of generating that offset, right? So that's one thing. I don't know if there are any thoughts on that, but that's my take.
Yeah, feel free to jump into the questioning if anyone has follow-up questions, but maybe I'll move to this Jen. And I mean, this idea of the societal response time that's needed to deal with climate change is really quite, it's hard to imagine how we can move as quickly as we need to, given how quickly we have not moved over the last several decades. And so yes, I mean, I resonate with your feeling about venture capital and startups as being able to move quickly. But I wonder if you are able to share any really good examples of this in Quebec from either your current role or other places where you've seen it. And also, what are some of the challenges? I mean, does that, ability to move quickly, does that decrease when you scale? If you become, bought up by a corporate, does that agility and movement get lost, or can it be mainstreamed and the momentum continue in that context? So maybe two different questions. But
yeah, I think those are really good questions. So maybe I'll start with a couple of examples of companies that we've met through our work at Cycle Momentum. So a good example is a company called Dispersa. I love telling this story because I got to meet the founder of Dispersa about 10 years ago when she was presenting at a TEDx conference about the results of her Expo Science project. So she was a CEGEP student at the time. And she was really affected by seeing some of the oil spills that were happening. And she was wishing that there was a way that she could invent something to counteract the impact of oil spills. And she discovered something called a biosurfactant. And I'm not going to go into detail on the technology because for me, it's just something magical that happens, and she'd be able to explain it much better. But essentially, it's a process to convert waste into a biological molecule that can break surface tension on liquids. So it works for breaking down oil spills, but over the course of the 10 years between when I saw her present first as a CEGEP student and when I saw her pitch her startup 10 years later, she had made a lot of progress on figuring out which were the best markets and the greatest impact that she could have with that technology. So today, the company is established and it's building one of its, starting to scale from being in the laboratory to bench scale, and then growing to a larger scale production facility. And she's figured out that the best use of that technology is actually to replace petroleum products and palm oil in day-to-day products like detergents and other things like that. So a biosurfactant is something that can be used to take out of production a lot of the uses of petroleum products and palm oil, and replace it with something that comes from waste and is converted into something that biodegrades and has all of those good properties. So that's a great example of how a green chemistry initiative can help to reduce the use of fossil fuels in a really meaningful way. So when I met her 10 years ago, she was a student with an idea, and today she's someone who's raised $3 million and is building her first plant right now. So that's a great example of how, it takes time for the technologies to mature, but, starting with things that are largely technologically de-risked today can become something quite meaningful over time. And the funds that she raises now will get her, hopefully, over the next few years to a scale where it becomes of interest to a corporate, initially as a partner. So initially she'll be looking for, she'll be manufacturing it and then looking for distribution channels. I don't know what her plans with the company are longer term, but it's pretty common for that path to go, at a certain point you decide that as a small company, you no longer have the road to market that you would need to be able to take that vision and, take it out to the world on the scale that it could be done. So at that point, it's no longer about innovation in the technology. It's no longer about innovation in the way that you take it to market. It's really a moment when a larger player can take it over and it makes economic sense to do so. There's not a premium that has to be paid for it. They're not going to make less money than with the thing that they're already using. So it's replacing a product with something that's going to be more sustainable and can really scale. I think that's a great example. I've got lots more that I could go into if we have time.
Okay, thanks. Maybe I'll just pass over to the first gen. I mean, we've done, three very different perspectives here. I think it's symptomatic of the challenge of how to involve so many different types of actors in this problem. From where you said, like, what do you think how do we bridge all these disconnected actors in the finance area and yeah, like including local or from local actors to big corporates, and how do we make that work?
That's a pretty big question. I don't know that I have a perfect answer. I mean, I think from my perspective, I see a big role for boundary organizations who have traditionally operated sort of between science policy. I'm thinking, the OECD, UN Environment Program, the World Economic Forum. These are the types of organizations that I think have the scope and the reach and the capacity to really start bringing together the different actors that really need to be around the table. And, one of the key findings in the figure that I was sharing earlier is really the need to build trust, because I think that a lot of times, when we were doing consultations to develop that figure, a lot of the actors in philanthropy, they didn't sit in the same room as, people working in VCs or, other forms of finance. They didn't have that sense of community of like, we can work together to solve some of these massive challenges. And I think that that's where I see organizations like the World Economic Forum, like UN Environment Program, playing a bigger role in actively convening different groups who could together have a greater impact than they might on their own. So I think that's a big piece of the equation. I think it's also really critical to involve local actors, especially when we're talking about, initiatives that take place on the ground. Some of the carbon credit programs that are out there. I mean, these are, as you mentioned, Manuel. Whoa, okay, they're locally rooted, right? They impact people who live in these areas every single day. And so I think it's also really important to think about how they can play a role in it. And it's not easy, because I think just the sheer number of people who are impacted by these types of projects is astronomical. But I do think that, that's really key to a lot of these holistic approaches, is actually thinking about how stakeholders can not only be the beneficiaries of different projects, but actually actively contribute to their success. And so thinking not only in terms of the benefits to climate mitigation, how many tons of CO2 we're mitigating, but also thinking about the social benefits, thinking about the impacts much more holistically across different areas. And for me, that's really core to the Sustainable Development Goals. So the core tenet is really leave no one behind. And I think to live that, to actually value that in reality, means engaging with those local stakeholders. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, yes. So thanks. So that, you brought up the SDGs. I mean, we're also coming up to the next COP in Dubai at the beginning of December. I mean, finance is going to be a big question of how to fill the finance gap. And I guess I'll pose a question to any and all of you, and you can all say a few last words before we open up to questions from the audience. But I mean, what do you think the big needs are or opportunities to make progress in this domain? And also, you're thinking there are students in the audience who are likely have ideas, but also interested in knowing how to best contribute to this challenge. From your various perspectives, like what do you think are the big needs and opportunities in this space? Since you have the mic, you might as well start.
I was going to say, it seems convenient. This is the efficiency. So I think for me, from the investment side, from the funding side, I think, really the connections, trying to build bridges between different funding communities is key, but so is changing the culture. So I think a lot of people, projects that get funded are scared of reporting what doesn't work. I mean, I think we're sort of trained, right? You want to say what worked, what's shiny, what's, the positive outcomes. But as a result, I think we're losing a really big opportunity to learn from what isn't working, actually. So I think, in the spirit of accelerating progress, I think that changing the culture of reporting, both the expectations on the funding side, but also, what the actual projects are reporting on is really critical. And then just on the climate action side, I think actually really changing the way that projects are devised is really critical. I mentioned it very briefly earlier, and hearing Jennifer speak as well really drives home this need for projects to really build a business model and think about your theory of change, not just, as applying for a research grant, but thinking about the longer term impacts that can maybe, attract different forms of investment, and have a more sustainable long running impact. Thanks.
Je peux y aller. Du point de vue des assureurs, je dirais qu'au niveau des leviers ou des opportunités qu'on peut avoir, je reviens sur nos émissions qui proviennent majoritairement des scopes 3, le volet financier et le volet assuré. Au niveau du volet financier, je fais un peu de pouce sur ce que Jennifer vient de dire. On est des gros investisseurs institutionnels, donc assurément qu'on peut engager la discussion avec nos différents émetteurs, essayer de peut-être les amener à aller vers des pratiques plus vertes, je dirais. Donc, ça, c'est un des leviers que les assureurs ont. Puis, évidemment, d'essayer de décarboner notre portefeuille, nous aussi. D'un autre côté, du côté des émissions assurées, il y a beaucoup, là, on le sait, la température a déjà monté de plus de 1 degré depuis l'ère pré-industrielle. Donc, on est plus en mode essayer de s'adapter. Donc, les assureurs essaient de plus en plus d'amener leurs assurés à s'adapter, justement. On voit ça, des fois, des assureurs envoient des courriels. Est-ce que vous avez préparé votre maison pour l'hiver? Est-ce que vous avez installé vos pneus d'hiver, etc.? Donc, tu sais, c'est une autre façon là, de peut-être essayer de profiter du vent de changement là, pour aller dans le sens un peu plus vert, je dirais.
Thank you. So maybe just to conclude, and going back to a point that Jennifer just made, one of the things that we're seeing in this validation process, we have a project with onboarding agricultural land in Mexico. So that's where it became real to us, the fact that it actually is not only land that it's capturing carbon. It's actually communities project. It's about waste management. It's about almost all of the SDGs, social development goals. They have a dimension around carbon offset. So eventually it won't be only about carbon. It might also be about, like I said, waste management, the role of women in these communities, education, culture as well, because there are many practices that are rooted in those lands, and that if you do not support these kind of projects that are traditional, you might lose as well. So there are many dimensions. So maybe eventually thinking about marketplaces or markets that can also funnel capital to these initiatives. How do you do that? That's challenging too, because then how do you measure that impact. With emissions, that's more or less clear, but it still is difficult, right? How do you measure how much carbon are you capturing? That's somehow a physical question in terms of physics. Whether these ones is more complex, right? So it's culture, it's society, it's a community. But there's a neighbor opportunity there on how you use the same mechanism to make the flow of capital go to where it's supposed to be and to where it has more impact. So that's what I would say.
Great. I'll start first with opportunities. So when I talked to, I put up that slide of the 40 plus investors that are interested in seeing Quebec's climate solutions. About half of them are from outside of Canada. And so when I talk to them about what they like about the Quebec ecosystem, what I hear is that we've really put in place a really strong climate finance stack in Canada. And in particular in Quebec, because some of the technologies that are harder to get from that lab scale into the commercial area, we have access to a lot of non-dilutive funding, meaning there are government grants that are available, there are programs to support companies. So there are a lot of different sources of capital that are available that can help to de-risk it so that private equity can come in and really help to speed it. So that's an opportunity that we have. We have great benefits here in our ecosystem. Always more of that is good. Unfortunately, the Sustainable Development Technology of Canada, SDTC, has frozen their funding for about 3 months right now due to some investigations into their processes. So we're seeing the impact of that every day on companies when sources like that are not available. The other thing that's an opportunity, there have been a few programs that have been launched recently. In particular, last year in the US, there was the Biden administration's Inflation Reduction Act, which unlocked billions of dollars in tax credits and other programs for climate technologies. The impact of that has been to create a secure market for and a predictable market for the coming period for many people who are developing climate technologies. We've had a smaller version of that in Canada, and basically that's those kind of programs create those opportunities. The need is to make them predictable in a way that's not subject to political will or changes with elections. So what's needed more than anything right now, I think, is predictability in the types of markets that are available and the support that we have from the political layer. So by making that a law as opposed to a program that's tied to the particular person who's sitting in the Oval Office at that time, that's been a huge boon for anybody who's developing climate solutions, and that's really going to have an impact. So yeah. Needs are having predictability and stability in the markets, and the opportunity is having that access to different sources of capital that can help to attract others.
If only economic systems were as predictable as the climate system itself. So yeah, we have a bit of time. I'm happy to field questions from the audience. I believe there should be a microphone somewhere. So if you would like to pose something to me or any of the panelists, please raise your hand and someone will come by with a microphone for you.
We're going to hope our microphone works. Also, if anyone on Zoom has any questions, just pop them in the chat. You can also turn on your mics, but just let us know.
Hello, I have a question for you, Madame Royer from Beneva. It's about you mentioned scope 3 emissions from your investment portfolio and wanting to have a plan to reduce them. So like on the quantitative side, are there projection models to like project carbon emissions, or how do you assess the carbon intensity of various asset classes, or how do you try to do that as an institution? Yeah.
Si j'ai bien compris la question, c'est comment on fait pour calculer nos émissions de carbone au niveau de nos placements? Oui.
Exactement. Puis même, est-ce qu'il y a des modèles pour essayer de les projeter dans l'avenir, ou est-ce que... Donc, comment établir un plan pour faire ça?
Ben, en fait, c'est un peu ce que j'ai mentionné. Pour le calcul des émissions de carbone, il y a une méthodologie qui a été développée, qui a été tout récemment publiée. J'ai juste les abréviations en tête, là, PICAF, mais rapidement comme ça, là, les lettres, faudrait que je le recherche, là, mais selon cette méthodologie-là, ça permet là, justement là, d'avoir une uniformité dans le calcul de ces émissions-là de Scope 3 qui sont un peu plus indirectes, là, on va se le dire, là. Donc, ça évolue très rapidement, là. Puis, tu sais, cette méthodologie-là est autant au niveau de nos placements que, comme je disais, du volet de ce qu'on assure aussi, là, pour avoir la vue globale au niveau du Scope 3. Est-ce qu'il y a une projection? Ben ça va aller avec le plan de transition là, que chaque assureur qui s'est engagé net zéro, évidemment, va décider de mettre en place là, pour arriver à zéro en 2050. C'est l'objectif, évidemment, qu'ils ont pris. Donc, la projection en tant que telle va se faire en suivant le plan de transition. Là. Il va, évidemment que pour atteindre un objectif, c'est bon de se fixer certains jalons puis de le mesurer fréquemment pour voir où on en est rendu. Puis j'ajouterais peut-être qu'au niveau de la réglementation canadienne aussi, il y a beaucoup de nouvelles exigences qui sont en train de se mettre en place, qui est justement une source de risque de transition. Là. Tout à l'heure, j'ai peut-être passé vite sur la définition du risque de transition là, qui provient notamment de changements à la réglementation, comme les autos à essence les nouvelles autos à essence qui ne pourront plus être vendues dès 2035, peut-être une nouvelle taxe sur l'essence, etc. Ça vient aussi de nos parties prenantes qui peuvent nous mettre de plus en plus de pression d'adopter des pratiques vertes, mais il y a aussi tout le volet réglementation, je dirais, qui est en train de se mettre en place beaucoup au Canada. Il était déjà en Europe. Puis, dans cette réglementation-là, ben, on va avoir à effectivement faire des scénarios de projection, plus de nos états financiers, de notre stratégie, comment elle pourrait se réaliser sous différents scénarios climatiques. Mais ce que je veux dire, c'est que dans ces scénarios-là, exemple, si la température, on ne fait plus rien, elle monte à 6 degrés, si on transitionne de façon très, très désordonnée rapidement, on met tout en place, puis là, ça cause des impacts sur les marchés, bien, il va falloir tenir compte du plan de transition qu'on se sera donné. Donc, ce sera peut-être une façon, là, je ne sais pas si ça répond à ta question, mais de suivre nos émissions de Scope 3. Voilà. Merci.
Other questions from any of the audience? Don't be shy. Yes, Tim, in the back.
Bonjour. You mentioned about Quebec, but are there other funds in the other provinces?
Maybe directed to you, Jackie.
Yes, our program is in Quebec because it's funded by the Ministry of the Environment in Quebec. There are climate investors that are active across the whole country. We're in partnership with many of them. There are also strong programs across the country for, in particular, grant programs and non-dilutive funding for climate solutions. Alberta has some pretty strong programs. One's called Emissions Reduction Alberta. There's similar initiatives in British Columbia and in Nova Scotia. Invest Nova Scotia is very active. So definitely there are counterpart programs across the country that are working on this.
Yes, Micheline, put up your hand higher. So.
Thank you. I have a follow-up question for Karine, actually. You mentioned PCAF. I was curious, so I checked it out. It's an industry-led partnership. So basically, I understand that it is a voluntary basis, and that it says, do you want to join us or something? Is there any effort to make something like PCAF more, not voluntary, but mandatory, like you were mentioning Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3. I know in Europe they are becoming mandatory, and here it's more on the voluntary side as well.
Un peu comme je le mentionnais, dans la nouvelle réglementation que le régulateur au fédéral a publiée cette année, sur la gestion du risque climatique. De mémoire, les émissions, même de scope 3, devront être calculées notamment avec cette méthode-là. Donc, ce sera probablement une façon de le rendre obligatoire plus que juste volontaire. C'est ma compréhension, là. C'est sous toute réserve, mais les travaux vont vraiment bon train au niveau des exigences réglementaires, là, puis ça avance beaucoup, puis ça va être de plus en plus, je dirais pas contraignant, là, mais ça va devenir de plus en plus exigé, là, notamment d'avoir une divulgation basée sur le cadre TCFD, là, le Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, annuellement, puis donc suivre nos émissions de carbone, incluant, je crois, les scopes 3.
Any other questions either from the room or if there's anyone on Zoom who would like to, yeah. You still have the mic or you need it back?
This question is actually about Pattaya. You mentioned that you are onboarding farmers in Mexico already. Can you tell us a little bit more about what do they farm and how does that work?
Yeah, well, this is a very pilot project that we have. Actually, we got funding from the government of Quebec to do this. So it's about what's the name in English? It's an agricultural. It's l'élevage. L'élevage régénératif. So these are practices to change the way they deal with cattle, so that how they take them to one place to the other to grass in a way that the ecosystem actually flourishes more, because they do it in a way that it doesn't just deplete the resources, but it actually it doesn't use any medication or anything for the cattle, so that it's like more green, if you want. So, and what we're doing is we're trying to measure, we're partnering with the local university and with a local partner that gives us satellite images so that we can map the benefits of having the cattle grass this way versus not, and try to map that to how much carbon you are sequestering, because you're enriching the soil, there's more grassland, there's more animals that come and live in this ecosystem. So there's an additional benefit to do it this way versus the way they are doing it now, like an industry at scale. So we're doing that. So that's what we're doing. So on board, measuring on the ground how much carbon we are sequestering from these practices, and trying to go through the validation certification process to issue a valid offset for this practice. So that's what we're doing in Mexico. Yeah. Yeah, because there's the whole thing of how do you measure, how do you validate, how do you bring it to the marketplace in a way that corporations see it as a valid offset, and then when in the marketplace they can buy it directly, and then we are removing intermediaries with this marketplace.
I had a question about the carbon offset. So you'd mentioned that carbon offset projects are gaining popularity, and there's a focus on carbon capture technology also.
Yeah.
But nature-based solutions tend to do more than just sequester carbon. They also offer ecological services like flood mitigation or drought. Is there any way to evaluate those services and include that in your financial evaluation?
Yeah, we're currently not looking at those. We're looking at agricultural base and waste management, but yeah, there might be ways. I don't know if anybody else has a better view on those, but yeah, and actually that's the challenge. How do you take those data points and you bring them into a computation that actually says this much carbon is being sequestered by this practice?
I think you've hit on something really interesting there, because basically the reason, like with those kind of initiatives, it's an opportunity to put value on something that hasn't been valued by the market in the past. So even the fact of being able to assign a value to carbon sequestration is, we see how much, how much volatility there is in that market. And, that's really a very innovative space. So the other aspects of it, the other benefits that come from it are similarly, I think it's just further away from being able to get to clarity about it. But it is very encouraging to see, the way that we're thinking about those initiatives, and we're starting to see more examples of it. I work with an organization that is a humanitarian assistance organization. I'm on their board, and they had developed an app in Africa for nomadic people who were to help them to find water for their animals. And at a certain point, they realized that the benefit of those animals moving over the land, that there was that aspect about carbon sequestration from it. And so they've gone through the process now of evaluating what the potential for carbon credits is with it, and with the idea that they would be able to turn those funds back to the people themselves in the community. So you see that that's the first step of it, but the benefit of the regenerative effects of it and recognition of that, I think, is really powerful. So I think we're just early days on that. But unfortunately, where the market is, because there's so much noise in it, and there's so many claims that have not been validated, then the market is trying to push for even greater certainty about the actual impacts that are being measured, and setting higher standards for that, which is obviously Manuel's area.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to add really, really briefly to that I think at the international scale, we're seeing a lot of movement by groups like the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, so IPBES, to try to really sort of create a benchmark or like a more consistent framework for valuing, nature's contributions to people. And I think that that's the type of work that is needed. We need to have a bit more of a consistent approach, because otherwise, it gets really, really complicated, right? Trying to calculate different contributions of biodiversity to social, cultural impact. There's so many different impacts that putting a monetary valuation on those becomes really, really difficult. So I think, the work of different organizations like IPBES, like a lot of, Manuel's work in carbon offset, that type of work will hopefully eventually start to create more of a framework that people can get on board with more easily. So I think the building blocks are there. So it's hopefully, I think we'll see a floodgate at some point. Thanks.
Maybe we'll wrap up here, but I'd like to give everyone sort of one last opportunity to share any thoughts you may have remaining. Maybe coming back to the title of the panel, unlocking climate finance. This is the challenge, is how to really accelerate the little pieces that are starting to come together and scale them and direct the resources of the finance world towards this challenge. So maybe I'll just we'll go back in the opposite direction. Yeah, any concluding thoughts on the grand challenge embodied here?
Great. Well, I think what we've seen through the panel is that there are so many different elements to finance. So when we think about the potential transformation that can come from finance in driving climate solutions, there are as many different roads to that as there are different types of institutions and different kinds of finance. So figuring out where the levers are from where you sit is really important. And the other thing that I've been reflecting on as different people have been talking is the aspect of inclusivity. We heard that, from I think everyone here at the table, how giving access to different voices to be able to come forward with solutions and to allocate capital based on the quality of the solutions, making sure that it's that everyone has access to it is a really critical element of it. So for holistic solutions and to have the best ones go forward.
Okay, well, on my end, I think, well, unlocking the potential of climate finance, right? So I think we mentioned a few times that point that I want to bring back. So I think is the opportunity for our initiatives to value things that haven't been valued before, like Jennifer mentioned. So carbon sequestration, it's the ongoing theme right now. It's relatively easy. Well, it's not easy, but it's relatively straightforward to do it because it's physics behind it. And yet pricing it requires a marketplace for it to actually be priced. But then there are many other dimensions that need to be addressed, and the opportunities there. And I think the same mechanism, the same pipeline might be useful in those other cases. So I think we just need to find ways of doing it.
Ben, de mon côté, je terminerai juste en disant que j'ai dit le mot risque, je pense, plusieurs fois dans tout ce que je vous ai mentionné. C'est un mot que j'utilise souvent dans mon quotidien, mais j'ose espérer qu'il y a aussi des opportunités, on l'a entendu notamment, qui vont émerger de tout ça. Donc, j'essaie de rester positive. Merci.
Merci beaucoup. I think from my side, it's really just about bringing people together. I think, I'd mentioned a little bit different types of financial communities needing to come together, but I think also bringing that together again with, not to add another layer of complexity, but to bring that now together with, biodiversity scientists, climate scientists, people who are advancing the digital solutions. I know it sounds maybe humongous, but I think so is the challenge that we're facing. And, as Jennifer said earlier, if we don't all face this together, I think none of us can really achieve anything on our own. So for me, the big opportunity, and also I guess the challenge, is bringing all these groups together to find those most meaningful solutions. Thanks.
Well, that's an excellent segue to the next activity, which is to gather around the coffee table at the back of the room. So I'd like to thank you all again for being here. Thanks for coming to our event today. It's a big round of applause for the panelists. And so we have the room for another half an hour. So feel free to grab a snack at the back. If you have a question that you didn't get to or want to ask, don't hesitate to approach any of us to do so. And thanks again to Doug and Fourth Space for hosting us once again in impeccable technological fashion.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining us again for participating in this conversation. We're going to be closing up the Zoom and the live stream. Ernest, sorry, your question came in too late. I'll try to get it to Manuel after this. But please, stick around. Help yourself if you're in the space. And please join us again at Fourth Space. Have a great afternoon.